Katherine is an investigative reporter and author who covers religious liberty, politics, policy, education, and controversies over the separation of church and state. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, NBC, Washington Post, the New Republic, New York Review of Books, and The Advocate. And you may follow her on Twitter at Kath S. Stewart. Thank you very much, Katherine.
Thank you so much. It's really appreciate that, Christine. It's wonderful to be here. I want to acknowledge and thank all of you taking time out of your busy day to join in on this event. I'm grateful to Audrey Kingstrom, Bob Alderholt, Suzanne Harlan, Christine, of course, Ellie, and everyone else at Minnesota Humanists for providing us with this chance to share our insight and ideas. And after I speak, I'm really hoping to hear from you. I want to hear your questions, your experiences, and your perspectives on these issues. You know, these are really challenging times for all of us. And it'd be nice to imagine America in which we could all look forward to a moment of national unity in the face of an external threat like a global pandemic, or in the face of an economic crisis. So many American families are struggling, or even after a national election. But we all know that unfortunately, none of that is likely, not in America and not just now. It seems like as a country, we're more divided than at any time in recent memory. So the question is why? And I want to talk about one part of the answer. I don't think we can fully explain our divisions today without addressing the rise of religious nationalism in America. Christian nationalism is not on the fringes of American political life anymore. It is at the center of power. It has unprecedented access in the Trump administration. It's basically the idea that the United States was founded as a Christian nation and that our laws should be based on the Bible. It's this idea that we've moved away from this conception of America and that somehow we have to get back to that. This ideology is anti-democratic because it says that the foundation of legitimate government in the US is a particular religion. And it insists that that's what makes us distinctive and great, rather than our democratic system of government, or the fact that we live in a democratic republic, or our Constitution, or our long, if imperfect, history of assimilating very diverse people into a pluralist society. Christian nationalism is also a device for mobilizing and often manipulating a large subsection of the public and for persuading them to vote for candidates that the movement favors. Now I want to say something about what the movement is not. It is not a movement that is merely about symbolism. It is not merely about the expression of sincerely held beliefs in the public square. Everyone has a right to do that. The thing that's at stake in the rise of religious nationalism in the US is not whether we merely blur the line between church and state or offend the feelings of an outgroup. The thing that's at stake today is the most fundamental organization of our political system. It's about whether the United States will continue as a constitutional democracy in a pluralistic society united by an idea, the idea of a democratic republic, or not. Now, to be clear, it's possible to express one's faith in the public square and in politics while respecting the separation of church and state. Many leaders have done so while acknowledging the pluralism and diversity of our nation. On the other hand, there are those that seek to use the power of the state to impose the supposedly correct religious viewpoints on everyone else. I think of the latter as advocates for Christian nationalism. They're making use of these theological frameworks in order to justify political power over other people and groups. And the movement reserves a very special contempt for humanists and atheists. But you know, the attack on secularists isn't just a means to an end, which is to grow the movement and consolidate their power. It's almost like choosing a scapegoat. You know, this is what authoritarian movements do. They choose a scapegoat, upon whom to heap their contempt and sort of divide, you know, police the dividing line between the insiders and the outsiders, the pure and the impure. So let's look for a moment at the machinery of the movement, and then we're going to come back to that unique hostility for humanists that the movement sort of continues to amplify. The movement, I think it's really helpful when you're analyzing this movement to distinguish between the leaders and the followers, but it's not exactly a leader-driven movement as much as a sort of organization-driven movement. Certainly there's a collection of leaders, often personally interconnected, but the movement consists of a number of organizations. It's like a dense ecosystem of nonprofit, for-profit, religious, and non-religious groups. Many of the movement's leading figures have entrenched themselves into the highest levels of our governing institutions in ways that will long outlast the current administration. The leadership cadre and their supporters and allies have spent many hundreds of millions of dollars over decades building advocacy groups, policy groups, legal activist organizations, think tanks, messaging platforms, sophisticated data initiatives, all of the features of modern political campaigns, modern political campaign infrastructure, and they work in concert together, certainly during election cycles. In election seasons, the movement acts to transform many of America's conservative churches into what are essentially partisan political cells. So I want to talk for just a little bit about how that machinery targets the churches and the faith leaders. Leaders of the movement have figured out that pastors drive votes. You know, people tend to trust their pastors. And so leaders and organizations draw those pastors, conservative-leaning pastors, into these networks that get them all on the same page politically. They figure if you can get the pastors, you can get the people. And I've seen up front, you know, very close up how this works. I was researching my book and I attended a pastor gathering, a networking event at a church in rural North Carolina with dozens of other evangelical pastors in the area. The event was aimed at teaching them how to communicate to their congregations the key issues that supposedly matter in elections and this biblically correct way to vote on them. This was an event that was organized by an organization called Watchmen on the Wall. It's a family research project, it's a project of the Family Research Council. And Watchmen on the Wall has tens of thousands of affiliated pastor members. So there are all these different networks, networked pastors all over the country, and the network leaders give them these very sophisticated tools that tell them the supposedly correct way to vote in elections, that they should turn out their congregations, of course, to vote their supposedly biblical values. So from the moment I walked into this church to attend this event, I could tell this was not at all a politically neutral affair. Speech after speech focused on abortion as a way of signaling to the pastors that this is the issue that should matter most and that they should communicate to their pastors. A friend of mine who attended the event with me was sent a sample voter guide. It's got 7 or 8 yes or no questions, does this, you've got Jane Doe, Democrat, and John Smith, Republican, on the sample ballot. And 3 of these questions deal with abortion. So it's like basically signaling that this is the issue that should matter the most when you're talking to your congregations about how they should vote their biblical values. They've really weaponized the issue of abortion. They know very well that if you can get people to vote on a single issue, you can control their vote. So this sample voter guide was sent to him by the Faith and Freedom Coalition, which is led by Ralph Reed, who is the head of one of the organizations, one of the many organizations that make up the sort of infrastructure of the movement. He has promised to devote $40 million to this current election cycle. That's just one organization, and that's a lot of money. Of course, all political parties seek to sharpen their messaging and draw voters to their side during political campaign seasons. But by turning churches into partisan political cells, the religious right is exploiting and abusing their unique status that they are granted in our laws and in our tax code. Let's remember that churches and houses of worship enjoy unique special tax subsidies and exemptions from financial transparency laws that other for-profit and nonprofit, non-religious organizations simply don't get. Churches have this very special status. They just get more. And precisely for that reason, they're supposed to refrain from politicking from the pulpit. Tax exemption is like a gift from the government. It's a privilege. But in return for that privilege, non-religious nonprofit organizations have to, most of them, the non-religious ones, have to open their books so the IRS and public can see how the money was spent. Religions don't have to do that. Now, in addition, faith-based organizations get a host of other tax benefits and subsidies, and of course they're exempt from the anti-discrimination laws that apply to other for-profit and nonprofit organizations. They alone are allowed to discriminate against people of other faiths or ethnic groups, or women, or LGBT Americans, even members of racial minority groups. They're allowed to do that because they're a religion. But it's precisely for these reasons, because of these special and unique privileges, that religious organizations should refrain from politicking. And that's what the separation of church and state is all about. Now, let me tell you something about the political messaging of movement leaders. When they're talking to congregants or talking to the pastors about getting out the vote among their congregants, it's all abortion all the time. In fact, I heard one leader tell a group of Latino pastors that they were sort of targeting. He said, if someone asks you about the minimum wage, you ask them, what's more important, a few extra dollars or life? You know, so it's a little bit of money or life itself, sort of a leading question, trying to get these pastors to be like, oh, wow, forget about the minimum wage, we need to talk about abortion. I wish I had time to say more about the history of abortion here, the history of the abortion issue, and how it became sort of a core issue for this movement. But I will say one thing, that it is central to understanding the role of politics today. The story we've come to accept is that the religious right came together around widespread opposition to abortion arising from the grassroots up. That is just not true. It was leaders of a political movement back in the, I'd say like 70s and early 80s. They called themselves the New Right. It's a kind of precursor to today's religious right. They created the abortion issue as we know it, as a kind of us versus them issue. And they used it for political purposes. They used it to unite their movement. They knew that the movement, if they wanted to inspire kind of hyper-conservative counter-revolution, they were going to need the single yes or no voting issue to unite different groups of people. Now, let's not forget when Roe versus Wade passed in 1973, most Protestant Republicans supported it. The Southern Baptist Convention held the decision. You should look it up. It's unbelievable. They actually passed a resolution supporting abortion law liberalization in 1971, and I think they've passed either one or two additional ones. Many Republican politicians and figures from Barry Goldwater to Betty Ford supported abortion rights liberalization. But the issue of abortion was later settled on as one that could unite the ultra-conservative Protestants with conservative Catholics and ignite the hyper-conservative counter-revolution that these activists wanted. So when you look at the messaging that the political messages that the movement leaders today are sending to one another and to their elites in power, you know, to their political allies, and especially to their plutocratic funders, it is not just about abortion. A lot of it is about money. It's about how the Bible supposedly favors low taxes or no taxes for the rich, about how the Bible favors minimal government or no government regulation, about how the Bible is against environmental regulations and against the government funding of the social safety net, about how God is a hyper-capitalist and doesn't want the government to tax the rich directly, or to tax the rich and proportionately or directly fund any initiatives that might help working people and working families. It's really kind of incredible. The religious right claims to stand for family values, but they're embracing social and economic policies that make it harder for American families to succeed. Every year, you know, I've been researching this movement for about 10 years. I've published a couple of books on the topic. So over the past 10 years, I've attended multiple like right-wing conferences and strategy meetings and, you know, pastor networking events and, you know, key gatherings. And every year I attend this one major gathering called the Values Voter Summit. It's a conference that takes place in DC, sponsored by the Family Research Council, which is one of the leading policy groups of the religious right. And it features, it's like sort of like, you know, the band's all here, features many of the movement leaders and key activists. and attract some of its most sort of devoted soldiers. So last month's Values Voters Summit, which I attended, Franklin Graham, I'm sure you guys know who he is. He was one of the featured speakers. And he spoke, every single speaker at this event I attended, the Values Voter Summit, spoke approvingly of Trump. And here's what Franklin Graham said. He said, he has a vision of the country that existed in the 1950s and 1960s, and he wants that back. And we have a vision of America that existed during the 1950s and the early 1960s, and we want that back too. Sorry, he said early 1960s, not later. 1950s and early 1960s. So there's a lot to unpack here. During those years, segregation, racial discrimination, and gender discrimination were legal and rampant, from workplaces to schools to housing to financial services. There was tons of redlining, which is why we have so many segregated neighborhoods today. There was a lot of discrimination against women in employment, financial services, Black people, same thing. It was illegal to be gay. If you were gay, you were excluded from practicing law or medicine or any number of other, any number of other professions. You could be arrested. But the one thing, so, I mean, that's a kind of, they're nostalgic for this time. But, here's one thing that America did have in the 1950s and 1960s. And that is a lower level, and this is something we should all think about, a lower level of economic inequality, a stronger middle class, strong public education, a more secure white working class at least. Now, why is that? In the 1950s, the typical CEO made 20 times the salary of his or her average worker. So that gave the CEO a pretty nice lifestyle, right? You could buy a house, a boat maybe, or take nice vacations. Well, let's fast forward to 2017. CEO pay at a Standard & Poor's 500 index firm has soared to an average of 361 times more than the average worker, or nearly $14 million a year. This is a far cry. So the average worker pay has gone down and the average CEO pay has gone way up. It's gone into the stratosphere. So if you think about, it's like going from here to here. It's a far cry from the situation in the 1950s and 1960s that Franklin Graham seems to long for. So if we're going to be generous toward Franklin Graham, we might assume he's not nostalgic for the time that the subordination of people of color, of women, was enforced by law. Let's assume, if we're being charitable, that he's actually nostalgic for a time when the middle class was stronger and when the center appeared to hold. And yet, the religious right is allied with these libertarian economic groups, sort of Koch influence network, groups like American for Prosperity, and so many others, the DeVos and Prince affiliated groups, the think tanks like Acton Institute. These groups support the intensification of these inequalities. The hyper-conservative political candidates that the movement supports are sort of allied with this economic agenda that is destroying the middle class and degrading life for working families. A lot of this comes back down to money. And I learned a lot about that when I visited a large agricultural fair in California's San Joaquin Valley. I was there to attend the 20th anniversary celebration of Ralph Drollinger. He's the founder of Capital Ministries. It's a ministry that targets political leaders at the very top levels of government. Drollinger's weekly Bible study group in the Capitol has been attended by at least 12 current and former members of Trump's cabinet. He has also held Bible study groups targeting the Senate, the House of Representatives. So he's arguably one of the most politically influential pastors in our country. By the way, Michelle Bachmann is a big fan of Drollinger. She was there too at the event. I remember she made a joke, it was funny. She said, "We are from Minnesota, we put on our coats in September, we don't take them off till June." I thought that was kind of clever. But the rest of the stuff she said was alarming. So I'll talk about it for a little bit. The expansiveness of Drollinger's position, which he laid out at this speech in some ways, and which you can read more of on his website and through his published works, he's got these very expansive positions on domestic, economic, and foreign policy issues. And that hits home the fact that Christian nationalism is a political movement. It's not merely a stance in the so-called culture war. It's not just about abortion. Drollinger weighs in on a number of social and economic policy questions, including the idea that social welfare programs have no basis in scripture. He favors tax policies that benefit the rich. I remember there's one teaching I found that he said if the government doesn't adopt a flat tax immediately, like, he said this would be, cause for rebellion of some kind. I can't remember the exact wording, but it was pretty astonishing. It's like he knows exactly how God wants people to be taxed. Kind of astonishing. These teachings reflect an underappreciated fact about the movement, which is its long-standing alliance with the libertarian far-right economic wing of the Republican Party. Many members of the rank and file, we're talking a lot these days about why people vote, how they vote, how could they possibly support a leader as transparently amoral as Trump. Well, many of the rank and file end up voting their values on abortion, but in fact, they would actually want to keep their coverage for pre-existing conditions in healthcare plans. They themselves might benefit from higher minimum wage laws or worker protections or better funded public schools for their kids. But the economic policies that Christian nationalist leaders endorse are intensifying economic inequality and destabilizing our society. And yet, while they're opposing government handouts to the poor, they advocate for policies that direct the flow of government money to faith-based organizations. So it's not like they don't want the government to fund anything. They just want the government to fund their churches and religious organizations. This is a way of compelling us, the taxpayer, to directly fund churches through our tax dollars. This is precisely what our founders did not want to happen. So I want to get back to that sort of religious rights hostility to humanists and how it sort of ties in with the bigger picture. One of the roots of the problem is that it is frankly difficult to sustain. It can be difficult to sustain religious belief systems. And one of the ways in which it is sustained is by the demonization of those who do not believe. You find this in many religions and throughout history. You see, blasphemy laws, sort of idea that you're inside or you're outside, you're of the world of the sacred or the world of the profane. But there's another more salient political explanation. The religious rights political leaders understand that when people are humanists or secular, they reject the authority of religion, of received wisdom about a particular religion in laws that are common to all in a pluralistic society. They'll reject the theocratic model of power. Not only that, but if you look at partisan identification now, it has become a big separator. If you claim that you're not particularly religious, or if you're a religious progressive, or even a moderate religious person, you are not going to support a political system that is based on reactionary religion. Let's also remember that a number of the Christian nationalists' most vocal supporters also identify as Christian themselves. I think most American Christians reject the politics of division and conquest that this movement represents. And the religious right reserves poisonous words for them too. So true religious freedom, of course, is the freedom of thought, conscience, and worship. It includes the freedom to worship any gods or none, and includes the freedom from having to participate in or fund any religion if you don't want to. But much of the activism of today's religious right aims at securing a license for certain faith groups to discriminate against certain other groups and conflate in the minds of the public their religion with the authority of government. It's a way of signaling to everyone through the law and through social symbols that there's a group that is privileged and other groups that are not deserving of privilege. It's funny, I just spoke last night to a friend who lives in Georgia who said in his neighborhood, he sees he lives in a very conservative neighborhood. He sees all of these beautifully tended lawns with 3 symbols grouped together on them, a cross, a wooden cross. Each lawn has a wooden cross, an American flag, and a Trump sign. This is religious nationalism. It's saying that you are a believer in the right religion, a true patriot, and you're going to vote this way. It's really, you know, it's a way of sort of saying you're either inside or you're outside, you're pure or impure. It's a way of, like, you know, establishing dividing lines in a pluralistic society. So the initiatives that the religious right is trying to push through our laws and that they cast on the language of religious liberty are really expressions of religious privilege. What today's Christian nationalists want is a trump card to overrule the law where it conflicts with their religious beliefs, and thus to withdraw from the social contract that binds the rest of us together as a nation. Since the Supreme Court is on topic right now, I want to talk for a minute about the late Justice Antonin Scalia, who is the great hero of Amy Coney Barrett. You know, ironically, it was Scalia who saw the danger best when he ruled in the 1990 case Employment Division versus Smith, that to make an individual's obedience to the law, quote, contingent upon the law's coincidence with his religious beliefs, unquote, amounts to, quote, permitting him by virtue of his beliefs to become a law unto himself. Now this, said Scalia, contradicts both constitutional tradition and common sense. Amy Coney Barrett, by the way, would do very well to heed by those words, but you know, Scalia was here rightly suggesting back in 1990 that simply allowing your own religious beliefs to guide or decide which laws you should or should not follow would be courting anarchy. Now that case centered on the question of whether a pair of Native Americans had violated a state ban on the use of peyote, even though their use of the drug was part of religious ritual. But when the demands were not coming from Native Americans, but from members of a faith group with which he identified, Scalia and his fellows rapidly lost track of the insight. So today it's all about, you know, religious liberty for me, but not for thee. So the big question is, what is to be done? I mean, first of all, there's so much we could do. Of course, we all know, vote and hold others in your circle accountable to vote. I was attending an Evangelicals for Trump event a couple of months ago, and one of the speakers there, he said, become an evangelist for voting. And I thought, yeah, we can do that too. Let's all be evangelists for voting. Do what you can to protect the right to vote and to ensure that every vote is counted. It's tricky with COVID, I get it, but ideally we would be volunteering to babysit our neighbor's kids so she can vote, asking our friends about their voting plans, driving people to the polls. But you know, there's a lot of other stuff we can do. We can make phone calls, we can volunteer to poll watch, you know, we have friends that are going to vote, and if we know that they're going to be waiting in lines, offer to bring them water or snacks and tools perhaps to make it easier. Maybe chairs for elderly folks so that they don't have to stand in line for hours. We're seeing a tremendous number of dirty tricks these days, efforts to disenfranchise people's vote, disenfranchise people by preventing them from voting. And that's a shame, but I actually think that we have the numbers. So if we can get out the vote in disproportionate numbers, I think that we can actually, you know, see some change. And if you voted in leaders who respect our democracy, once that's been done, and if they respect democracy, respect rule of law, the principles of pluralism and equality and church-state separation, hold them accountable to make good on their promises. Of course, there are many things that we can only achieve when we join together. The religious right has invested in all of the tools and strategies of democratic political culture. But you know, those same tools and strategies are available to all of us. I remember another event that I went to, Ralph Reed, who I mentioned earlier, he said, it doesn't matter, pay no attention to the polls. He said, doesn't matter the number of people, you know, our percentage, he said, the polls don't matter, our percentage is declining, our demographic is declining, He said, all that matters is who turns out on election day. And he's really right about that. They're using the tools of democratic political culture to dismantle democracy, but we can use those same tools to restore it. Thank you so much.